All right. So we want to talk about Edgar Allan Poe. In my experience teaching these classes, Poe is almost always everybody's favorite. So this is a part of the class that most people look forward to. And I think the appeal, at least partly, of Poe is just his reputation, um, the weirdness of much of his writing. And I think really the effect of the weirdness comes through in something that I want to talk to you about here in terms of his style versus what we see with Hawthorne. Um, and it's difficult to articulate, but I'm sure you noticed in going from reading the stories by Hawthorne to reading the stories by Poe that one of the things that Poe is so good at is an absolute saturation of sensory imagery. Um, the durations of his plots um, tend to be much more concise. Um, it's sort of odd, but what we get are far more use of summary, far more use of ellipse, so that we get focus on very short parts of the plot, moments, instants, and then long, relatively long periods in which there's almost a sense of unconsciousness. But when he is conscious and talking to us, the narrator very, very much a saturation of imagery. It gives the whole style of writing a sense almost of documentary. It's not realism, right? But it's a sense of documentary almost where there's so much information about what is being seen, so much information about what is being heard, but also a lot of information just about just situationally. So what we see, for example, in Ligeia is intense focus on the character, right? The description of the character of Ligeia versus the description of the character of Rowena, as well as lots of rich description about this marriage chamber, which is a very strange place. Then, when we look at the fall of the House of Usher, lots of description about what the house looks like and where it's setting, the tarn outside, the mist that rises around the building, description of the chamber in which the narrator sleeps, which is very similar in description actually to the chamber in Ligeia, minus some Egyptian sarcophagi, but it's a very similar structure in the sense that it's tall. You can't see the ceiling. You can't see into all the corners of the room. It's an oddly shaped room with large windows, curtains that have a lot of movement to them because of um, the wind outside coming into the room. So there's lots of tricks of light, tricks of sound. Uh, that's all very much Poe, and naturally, um, this is him developing this sort of new genre of mystery or detective blended with horror. It is almost accounts, documentary accounts like you would have from an investigator, a police officer, something like this, um, or accounts from a doctor, maybe even a psychiatrist, something like that. So it's a very different style. And I think that appeals to students a lot, the richness of the detail. And it feels like you're getting clues, puzzles to work out all the time, which is very handy because, very much like Hawthorne, you get these enigmatic endings a lot of times um, that leave you sort of wondering, well, what the heck was that all about? Uh, the difference is you feel like maybe if you go back and read through Poe again, there are clues and hints that if you could just see it again, then you could figure it out. Part of this, of course, is what we see here is first person narration. That is, you have a character narrator, right, indicated by I. The very first word in Ligeia is I. We don't get that with Hawthorne. Hawthorne is a what you traditionally call a third person narrator. That's kind of a funky term, but is a non-character narrator, right? There's an omniscience to it. Poe, at least in much of what we're going to read by him, you get this character narrator, which means you're very limited in your perspective of what you see, because you see and you hear only what the narrator character also sees and hears, right? You're not allowed to know other things, unlike young Goodman Brown, where you know what young Goodman Brown perceives, but you also know what the narrator tells you the situation actually looks like. In Ligeia, for example, we don't know at the end of the story whether or not Ligeia has resurrected into the body somehow of Rowena. We only know that this is what our narrator thinks has happened. Which brings up another very interesting point of discussion with Poe. When you have a character narrator, then there is always a question about reliability. When you have a narrator that is not a character, and especially a narrator that has a certain amount of omniscience, even if it's not complete omniscience, but a certain amount of omniscience, a limited omniscience even, there is an assumption that that is a reliable or trustworthy narrator. Once you have a character narrator, once you have this pronoun I telling you the story, then there are questions of reliability, because you're so limited on your perspective. Did this really happen the way the narrator is telling me it happened? Sometimes reliability is drawn into question because you don't know if you can actually trust your narrator, because the narrator might intentionally be misleading you. The narrator's a liar. The narrator's a psychopath. Then, the narrator doesn't want you to know the truth, or doesn't want you to know the reality of what happened. Or sometimes reliability is drawn into question simply by the nature of the narrator. And oftentimes in Poe, this is the issue. So if we look at this in Ligeia, for example, and for what it's worth, we have an unreliable narrator in 3 of the Poe stories that we read, if you count Ligeia. Ligeia's is borderline, but I still think there's some reliability issues. We want to see a really unreliable narrator, we look at something like The Telltale Heart or even The Black Cat. Those are much more traditional examples of the unreliable narrator, and that's something we'll look at. But if we look at Ligeia, how do we know that we're dealing with a potentially unreliable narrator? Well, look how the story begins. I cannot, for my soul, which is like saying on my honor, right? Something like that. I cannot, for my soul, for the life of me, on my honor, remember how, when, or even precisely where I first became acquainted with the lady Ligeia. So, this is our first sentence. Hi, I'm going to tell you a story. Unfortunately, I don't know the how, the when, or the where of the story. Okay. So, immediately you're like, what? Unreliable narration. Part of this is an issue of memory, and this is something that Poe loves to toy with. How accurate is our memory? When we remember something, we know that we don't remember things perfectly, right? Human memory is not real good. Even in the short term with things that happen to us, our ability to recall specific details is not great. And a lot of times it's not objectively accurate, because what we recall is our perception of the events rather than the actual events themselves, right? So there's an amount of interpretation that goes into the recollection of things. That's something that Poe was very interested in exploring. Um, so right away we know there is a character narrator, and we don't know if we can completely trust this narrator, because this narrator clearly doesn't have a tremendously good grip on recollecting these events. He says what he does remember, though, is that it was somewhere in a large old decaying city near the Rhine. Okay. So, Germany? Maybe? Um, and, it's old. Here's the point, right? For us, we've been looking at this American Gothic with Hawthorne, where it's almost exclusively set in what becomes the Gothic American setting, that is, these old forests. Poe likes to take us back to Europe. Let's go back to a more traditional Gothic setting. Why? Well, there are a variety of reasons, probably, that he prefers this. He really wants to draw on the connectedness of people to buildings. We'll see this particularly in The Fall of the House of Usher, but he's really interested in this antiquity, not just of people and of places, but of buildings, and the effect that those buildings have on the people who live within them. There's also within all of this a very general sort of commentary on the decline of Europe, right? Remember, what part of what Hawthorne is looking at is this rise of America, looking backwards on some of the problems and cautioning them about the direction, but still looking at an inclining, young, relatively, America. Poe has this very critical eye for the kind of decline of Europe. So there's some commentary in there, probably, that appealed to an American audience, and still appeals to an American audience. Like, your stuff is old and it sucks. But what he does recall, he says, is the woman of Ligeia. But even that, he says, when he describes her, it's interesting. He says on page 740, there is one dear topic, however, on which my memory faileth not, is the person of Ligeia. But listen to his discussion. She was tall, somewhat slender, right? I would in vain attempt to portray the majesty, the quiet ease of her demeanor, etc. He doesn't really tell us anything about her. Yeah, I remember Ligeia. She was, tall and thin, and he does remember, however, that she would come and go like a shadow. Now, this is very interesting. It's very Gothic, right? His description of her is as though she's almost a spiritual being. He can't hear her footfalls. He does not hear her when she comes and goes out of the room. He doesn't seem to have a clear recollection of who she is or where he met her. He never even thinks to ask for her family name before they get married. It's as though he's completely enchanted by her in a very literal sense. And that all the time he spends around her, his mind is not clear. There is one part, well, two really, but one in particular part of her physical being that he can recall, and that is her eyes. He spends 3 long paragraphs describing her eyes, right? We have one really long paragraph in which he goes through sort of the aquiline shape of her nose, and the pallor of her skin, and the darkness of her hair, right? Everything about her is very dark. And then he gets to her eyes, and he says, for eyes we have no models in the remotely antique. It might have been, too, that these eyes of my beloved lay the secret to which Lord Verulam alludes, which is the will, right? The power of the will. So there's a suggestion of, through her eyes, she can exert her will. Oh, this is a very vampiric um, quality, and you'll recognize probably fairly quickly as you read Ligeia, this is a vampire story. Now, you don't get the fetid breath, you don't get the sucking of the blood, but what you do get are all the other sort of qualities of a vampire that we would expect in reading a vampire narrative. Here, the vampire is a beautiful woman. 3 paragraphs describing her eyes. They're large, unusually large, Disney princess-like, and dark, liquid, black, inky, deep, piercing, penetrating. To go along with that is a tremendous intellect that she has, which the narrator says is notable, and sometimes students will take offense at this, but the reality is, I mean, women didn't have access to the same kinds of education traditionally that men had access to. So her mastery of languages and history and these sorts of things was unique for her, and it might have indicated her status, right? But he says, actually, it's not just women. Where's the man who has all of this knowledge? There's a suspicion that it would have taken more than a lifetime to accumulate the kind of knowledge that she possessed. Well, she grows ill, we're told, on 743. The disease is not clear, but he is aware that she must die. She seems to be almost sort of fading away. And then by the end of the page, she's dead. We're told she perished. I gazed upon the corpse. Okay, so there is an assertiveness there, a definiteness. On 744, he says she died. Okay, that's it. Immediately after she dies, he leaves. It's almost as though he's been released by a spell. He takes the money he had. He leaves. He has no sense of needing to stay in that place. He purchases an abbey in England, and we're told the description of it is gloomy and dreary. This is a very sort of Hawthorne type description. And what else has happened? He becomes, he says, a bounden slave in the trammels of opium. Now, opium we know is something that Poe struggled with in real life. It's something a lot of people struggled with because it was a pretty common medicinal, remedy. And this accounts, possibly, for why his memory at various times is so unclear and why his senses are maybe not to be trusted. He remarries. The woman he remarries is the exact opposite of Ligeia. She is fair-haired, blue-eyed, and he knows her last name. She is Rowena Trevanion, and she comes from Tremaine. Okay, so he knows all about her, but he really doesn't, but he knows her family, and she is blonde, blue-eyed. This is everything that Ligeia was not. He constructs within this abbey, up in this octagonal tower, this very weird room, which I won't go through the details of, but he describes very clearly that it's a very weird room. He's not entirely sure why he decorated it the way he did. It's possible that it was the opium. It's possible it was the influence of Ligeia, something like that. All of the kind of Egyptian history and mythology and stuff that she had studied. He's not entirely sure, but it's a weird room. It's got these heavy drapes that obscure the light, but they flutter weirdly in the breeze. The light that comes through, he says, gives everything a weird pallor. And above all else, at the height of this very tall ceiling from which you can't see, hangs a censer with flame in it, with these designs around the outside, and it sort of sways and casts light in these weird images all around the room. And it causes all all of the scroll work and the carvings and the engravings and stuff around the room to look as though they're moving. It's a very weird kind of sensation, right? Very disorienting, very gothic. And it creates, he says on 745, a phantasmagoric effect. No kidding. So he's on opium. He's in this weird room where everything, and he has these opium dreams, he says. He hates this lady he's married. She becomes sick. She enters, he says, what is a perturbed state of half slumber, which he also describes as phantasmagoric. And she thinks she hears noises, he can't hear them, etc., etc., etc. Then all of a sudden, at the bottom of 746, he sits down, he mixes the opium with the wine. This is called laudanum. It's like really good Tylenol back then. He's going to offer her a goblet of wine because she's fainting, and he says, it was then that I became distinctly aware of a gentle footfall upon the carpet and near the couch, and in a second thereafter, as Rowena was in the act of raising the wine to her lips, I saw, or may have dreamed that I saw, fall within the goblet as if from some invisible spring in the atmosphere of the room, 3 or 4 large drops of brilliant ruby-colored fluid. So he thinks he hears someone walking through the room unseen, and he thinks he sees materialize out of the air 3 or 4 drops of blood that fall into the wine, and she drinks them. Transubstantiation. There's a suggestion in this of a sacrament of some kind, right? The Catholics believed in the and still teach the sacrament of transubstantiation, the theology of transubstantiation doctrine, right? That when the priest prays over the elements of the sacrament, that the wafers become the body of Christ, that the wine becomes the blood of Christ. There is a transubstantiation that occurs so that they no longer are symbolic, but they become the thing. And so there is a hint in this of that, right? That somehow out of the ethereal air, we have this blood that appears into the cup. She drinks it. And what happens after that, he says, it might have been my imagination. It might have been my fear. It might have been the opium. It might have been the late night. It could have been all of this. He said, I was sitting alone with a shrouded body. She's died, right? And he's sitting by her bedside. And he goes just through this weird kind of experience where he said, oh, I couldn't doubt any longer. She's still alive. He keeps seeing her 3 times, right? 3 times she sort of sits up and looks around. Every time she lays back down, looks more dead than the time before. Until near the end on 748, she arises from the bed, tottering with feeble steps, with closed eyes, with the air of one bewildered in a dream. The Lady of Tremaine stood bodily and palpably before me. She's wrapped in the bedclothes, much like Christ when he came out of the tomb, right? The wrappings fall. Black hair comes streaming out, and he's staring into those big, liquid, black eyes. And it's such a great ending. He just screams out, "Here then at last! Can I never be mistaken? These are the full and the black and the wild eyes of the Lady Ligeia." Wow. And that's the end. And we're left, right? He says the one thing his memory never failed him on, right? The one thing, he says, There's one topic my memory never failed me on, the person of Ligeia. Here he is at the end. He says, I can never be mistaken. This is her. She's back. Damn the opium, damn the dreams, damn the late hours and the terror. And this is her. She's back. But do you trust him? Do you trust him? That's not a question I can answer for you. It's the kind of thing you have to go through the text and look for your clues, and I've done that for you in large part. It's a question you'll have to answer for yourself and some of the other stories that you read, and I'll leave you to do that. But I wanted to sort of highlight the process, how you go about it. This is something Poe loves to do, and I think it's why students like to read him, because now you sort of want to go back through the story and go, where's the clue? Where's the moment when I find out it wasn't her? How do I prove it one way or the other? Well, I don't know if you can.